Hi, my name is Hayhoe. I'm glad to be here with you today virtually to talk to you a little bit about my experience with climate advocacy and climate action. So, as many of you may know, I am a physical scientist. But about 10 years ago, I transitioned to a social science program, in part because I was already realizing that the biggest barriers to climate action are not in the physical sciences. We have known since the 1800s that digging up and burning coal back then and oil and gas today produces heat-trapping gases that are building up in the atmosphere, wrapping an extra blanket around the planet. We've known since then just how much the planet would warm if we doubled or tripled levels of CO2 in the atmosphere. And it was the 1960s when scientists formally warned a US president of the dangers of climate change and the need for action. So if it's been that long, why aren't we acting? Well, at the system level, we have massive economic barriers to action. We live in a system that is incredibly skewed towards, first of all, leaving all the externalities, the damages from climate change, out of the equation, and subsidizing fossil fuels as much as possible, as long as possible. We also live in a society where there's huge resistance to change, and change costs more, even if we'll end up better off on the other side, than maintaining the status quo short term. But on an individual level, it's a little different. On an individual level, it's not lack of facts about polar bears and ice sheets that are holding us back. It's psychological distance and lack of efficacy. In other words, we don't think it matters to me here and now, and we don't know what real solutions look like. And in some cases, we even think the cure is worse than the disease. So how does a system change? A system changes through individuals using their voices to advocate for change. That is the connection between individuals and the change that we need at the scale we need. In our modern industrialized society, when we look back at the societal changes that have occurred over the last few hundred years, none of them happened because a CEO, a president, a king, a ruler, someone who had power, wealth, or influence just sort of woke up one morning and decided the world had to change. If you look at how slavery was abolished in the UK, if you look at how women got the vote, of how civil rights were enacted in the United States or apartheid was ended in South Africa, all of those were profound societal and system-wide changes. But they were initiated by individuals using what? The power of their voice to advocate for those changes, to show people what a better world would look like and what it needs to get there. So how do individuals change? How do we get more individuals to change the system? We have to tackle the two main barriers that are holding people back. And we often think today, well, people aren't worried, so we need to scare them. We just need more scary information. And when you look at headlines and when you look at the images that accompany a lot of news stories, you see the polar bears and the ice sheets so often that we are inured to them. One more record being broken, one more disastrous report being released. At this point, it hardly even registers. So, what should we do? How can we communicate about climate change effectively? We have to realize that most people are already worried about climate change. I live in the United States where 70% of people are already worried. About 75% in the UK or Canada, 83% of mothers, 86% of young people are already worried about climate change, but only 8%, at least in the US, are activated. The biggest gap we have is not the gap between those who are or aren't worried about climate change. The biggest gap we have, which is twice as big, is between those who are worried and those who are activated. So why are people worried but not activated? Because they don't understand how climate change matters here and now in ways that are relevant to me today. How does it affect my home, my job, my children, my food, the air I breathe, the water that comes out of my tap, the places I love? And what do real solutions look like? Now, some people say, and I've heard this quite a bit since I wrote my book, Saving Us, talking isn't enough. We're way past the need to talk. I say, well, we're not even doing it. And if we're not talking about it, why would we care? And if we don't care, why would anyone ever be expected to act about it? Talking is not sufficient, but talking is absolutely necessary as a first step towards societal change. And that's why Climate Outreach is one of my favorite organizations, because they get it. George Marshall wrote that book, Don't Even Think About It, How Our Brains Are Wired to Ignore Climate Change. All of the Talking Climate, the manual, the programs they have, all of them are aimed at starting these conversations that are constructive, that revolve around why it matters, what we have in common, and what real solutions look like. Does talking about it work? Does it knock over that first domino in that long chain that leads us to a better future? Well, we have many examples that show that it does. And I'm going to start with 2 negative examples. Did you know that climate denial didn't exist 30 years ago? The science did. We knew back then that climate was changing, humans were responsible, and the impacts were serious. But denial didn't exist. Why not? Because we didn't think it was happening now, and so the threat of imminent action did not yet exist. But when we started to see that climate was changing now and action was needed, denial swung into action. And what did denial do? It talked. It talked about what? It talked about how, climate change is natural. It's caused by something else, not you. And those solutions are terrible. They're going to take away your car. They're going to take away your truck. You can't fly. You can't eat. You can't have children. You can't do anything. The enemies of climate action know that communication works, and they used it incredibly effectively to keep us in a stalemate for 30 years. I'll give you another example that's even more recent, the Green New Deal. When it came out in December 2018, according to the Yale Program on Climate Communication, 57% of conservative Republicans supported it, 75% of moderate Republicans supported it. Within 4 months, that support had eroded by 25 points among conservative Republicans and 11 points among moderate Republicans. Why? It wasn't because the Green New Deal had changed. It hadn't. What had changed? Their opinion. How? Because people talked about it. So those are 2 bad examples, but let me give you a few positive ones. As you know, I do a lot of videos, including this one. In 3 Christian colleges, one that was very politically conservative, one that was a little bit less politically conservative, and one that was pretty politically neutral, but all the same level of conservative theology. 3 groups of students watched one of my 30-minute videos talking about how we know climate change is real, how it affects us, and what we can do about it. In every single one of those classes, students increased to the same level of concern and understanding about climate change. But the most conservative ones changed the most. That's why I live in Texas, and that's the power of communication. Now, there was another project that I was part of with David Fenton, New Climate Voices, and the Yale Program on Climate Communication. Through working with David Fenton, we created 4 short videos, and you can find them online at newclimatevoices.org. One of them featured Bob Inglis, who, as you know, is a former Republican congressman. One of them featured Jerry Taylor, who, as you know, speaks from a libertarian perspective. Another was by General Ron Keyes from the military. And then one was by me, speaking as both a scientist and a Christian. We talked about climate change through the frames that conservatives typically value, through frames of free market, personal liberties, Christian values, and the military. In other words, rather than starting with the premise that everybody has to agree with me on X, and then once we agree on X, then we can care about climate change, instead we said, what do people already care about that is directly affected by climate change today? And then the Yale Program on Climate Communication stepped in and aired those videos on social media in 3 purple districts. Purple meaning about equal number of Republicans and Democrats in the same district. Simply through being exposed to super short videos on social media, after a number of weeks, Democrat opinions on climate change increased by upper single digits, and Republican opinions on climate change, their opinions increased. Their levels of awareness, concern, and support for climate action increased twice as much as the Democrats. Why? Because climate change was being framed around their values. And when I asked Matt Goldberg, who led that study, why on earth aren't we doing this everywhere? Why are we not taking short videos like these and even making a few more and just putting them all over social media? Why are we not using social media for good instead of for the evil that it has been used for by so many people to sow divisiveness, disagreement, and spread misinformation? And he shrugged and gave me the same answer that I had when people asked, why isn't every Christian college using your materials? He said, we don't have any funding for it. All of this was accomplished. All of these people were reached. All of these minds have been changed with just a fraction of what's been poured into political campaigns, what's been poured into high-tech solutions, what's been poured into instigating massive system-wide change. And don't get me wrong, we need it all. We do need it all. But with just a little bit, so many minds can be changed. So many individuals can be activated, and that's how the system can be changed.